Hello, it's Abbott Austin again, and we're with the next class, class number 8 in the spirituality course. This 8th class will be on the theological virtue of hope. Now, I might need to have 2 classes on this theological virtue of hope because there's a lot to be said about it. I think it's very important, especially for some reason in our own day. It's sometimes been said that past theology, Catholic theology, neglected the theological virtue of hope. So I haven't found that to be the case. Actually, most of what I'm going to say is in many other cases is based on traditional church teaching, especially as found in St. Augustine and St. Thomas Aquinas. So I don't think that's true, but it's not always there in an obvious way. So we'll try to bring this out, what the traditional teaching is about the theological virtue of hope, or at least the general themes in that. People in the past have had different takes on some of this, I'm sure. But here's a summary. So this is often, faith, hope, and charity. There's different ways of listing the 3 theological virtues, but we talked about faith, right? So it's a virtue. It's a theological virtue. So God is the object, and God gives the grace to have this virtue. And a virtue, as we said, is a steadily ready ability to do an act that is fulfilling. So the virtue, the theological virtue, faith is a gift from God, has God as its object, and it's this ability, it's the ability to receive, accept as true, the revelation that God has given us. It's a revelation ultimately about God himself, who God is, right? It speaks about his plan for our salvation, but ultimately that says something about who God is. So it's about accepting as true from God what God has revealed to us about himself. Right? We need to be able to do that in order to be instructed and guided towards our salvation by God. And our salvation, we have said from the beginning, is to possess God so as to enjoy God. So the ultimate goal here is to enjoy God, right? Now, the theological virtue of charity or love is to seek or want God as one's end, right? So we want God as our final object of desire, of wanting, right? So we want to attain God in order to enjoy God, right? We realize that our union with God is what we are ultimately aiming for and ultimately want, and that by which we will be fulfilled, right? So put it really short or briefly, the theological virtue is to want God, okay? Or at least that's the act, and the virtue is the ability to want God above all else, to want, to possess, and to cling. I talked a lot about this. Love is a clinging love. We want to attain God. All right, so it's to enjoy God. The sense is that we will enjoy God when we attain him. Okay, so that's the goal, to enjoy God. We need faith, especially to be guided towards that goal. And we need charity if we're going to, can't be done against our will. We have to actually want this. Okay, now we move to hope. Okay, and so hope, I want to start going through a bunch of things in order to get to what hope is. So what we'll start with is not to say precisely what the active hope is, and therefore what the theological virtue is. What we'll start by is just to give the conditions when one finds hope. So we experience hope in our lives in different situations, right? So we'll back away from just the theological virtue of hope and think about hope in general, and then try to identify what are the conditions of which person has hope. Okay? Well, the first thing is that you want something. Right? You want some goal, and you don't yet have it, right? If you have the goal, if you have what you want, there's no question of there needing to be hope. But you want something, there's some goal, and you don't yet have it, right? That's the first condition that has to be in place if we're going to have hope. Okay, then the other thing then is there's something standing between you and what you want, you and the goal, right? So there's something interposing, right? And we can talk about it as a difficulty, a challenge, an obstacle, right? And it has to be overcome in order to attain what you want. So that's another second condition for hope, when there is hope. So there's something in between you and what you want, some obstacle, some difficulty, some challenge. Okay, and then what happens is when you have an obstacle between you and what you want, you either think the obstacle can be overcome, and then you have hope. Now, what happens when you think the obstacle cannot be overcome? What you have then is despair, the opposite of hope, right? So the first condition is you want something, you don't yet have it. Second is there's some obstacle, something in the way between you and what you want. And then the third thing is that you think that the obstacle can be overcome, right? So those are three conditions for hope. Let's just give some examples apart from the theological virtue hope. So consider this. Suppose someone, a young man named Alex, wants to become a medical doctor. Okay, so you have something that's wanted and yet not yet attained, the goal. The goal is to become a medical doctor. Okay, what are some of the things standing between Alex and his goal? There's a bunch of things that have to be overcome. Obstacles, difficulties, challenges, right? They are things like getting into medical school, which takes a bit of work. Getting through and graduating from medical school takes a lot of work. Taking on debt. You'll have to, if you're going to become a doctor, to take on debt. Can you do that? Right? So those are just some examples of things that have to be overcome, some obstacles or challenges in order to become a doctor. Now, at some point on Alex's journey to become a medical doctor, he can think to himself, I can't overcome these obstacles. They're too much. Med school, I didn't get into the medical school of my choice. Therefore, I'm just going to give up, right? You despair. But let's say you don't, and he thinks, well, I'll get into another medical school. There's still hope. In the midst of the studies, he might be discouraged by the difficulty of the studies and the demands of medical school. So there's another case where is he going to have hope or despair? Is he going to keep going and fighting for it, or is he going to give up and despair? Right? All these things. So there has to be a thought, though, that throughout, it has to be a thought that these obstacles can be overcome, and then you have hope. All right, leave aside that. Let's take another example, a little more mundane in a way. So let's say we have a young lady named Janice. And the latest smartphones that have come out, say it's the latest iPhone. I don't know if this still happens, but I think it used to happen. So just bear with me here, or at least go with the example. Right, so I think when the latest iPhone will come out, there'll be lines. There'll be lines outside the store, and you might have to wait for hours. Get in line, wait for hours in order to get the iPhone right away before it sells out. Okay, so the goal here for Janice is to attain the latest iPhone. The obstacle, the difficulty standing between her and her goal is waiting in line for hours. She has to give up a whole day, half a day, whatever it is. Okay, that's some difficulty that has to be overcome. And you can imagine Janice saying, that's worth it. I can do that. I can do that. I'm going to do it. And she has hope. She does it. She gets the latest iPhone. But you could also imagine Janice saying, I can't wait that long. It might be because she has a job. She can't give up a whole day or half a day. She has a job to do. So then she would despair. Or maybe she just doesn't have the patience, all right, to wait in line for that long. Right? And so then she gives up. Right? I can't overcome that. I can't deal with waiting in line for hours. Okay? So then she despairs. And, you might look at a case like that and also say, maybe it's good to despair. You shouldn't be hoping for everything. There's things we hope for that we shouldn't be. They're not worth it. Okay? But we'll leave that aside for now. Maybe, not sure. We'll talk about it later. All right, now we have some examples, talked about the conditions. Let's now look at the conditions for the theological virtue of hope, or the act that this is a virtue for. Okay, so the conditions are this. You have a goal. You want something. You don't yet have it. It's God, right? We have God to some extent, thanks to his gift of himself to us, but we don't have God fully in order to enjoy him fully. So that goal of having God and enjoying God, that is not yet fully attained, okay? So there's the first condition. Okay, what are the obstacles between the attainment of God, myself and the attainment of God? So there's a bunch of things you could list, actually, right? So this is something just worth thinking about. What are the obstacles? What are the difficulties, the challenges that one must face in order to and then have to be overcome in order to eventually attain God and enjoy God? Okay, so we can think of things that are external challenges, things that the source of these challenges are external. So for example, persecution. Being a Christian, I'm going to be made fun of, I'm be rejected by certain people, and therefore that's going to be hard. Can I deal with that? Can I be true to God in the face of these external sources of difficulty? Or you can have something within yourself. You have certain desires, competing desires, right? You should desire and want God above all else, but you want other things. And when there's a tension, you find yourself choosing these other things. So you can't overcome that difficulty in order to stay true to the journey towards God and attain God, right? So that has a more internal source, that challenge, right? If you look at, again, there's a lot to be said about this, but I'm just trying to exercise our minds a little bit in this. So in Matthew chapter 13, verses 20 through 22, it's an excerpt from the parable of the sower, or actually a little bit later than the parable itself, when Jesus is explaining it. So let me read that. The seed, right, he's describing different seeds. There's 4 different seeds. I'm going to focus here on his explanation of the second seed and the third seed, kind of seeds. The seed sown on rocky ground is the one who hears the word and receives it at once with joy. But he has no root and lasts only for a time. When some tribulation or persecution comes because of the word, he immediately falls away. Okay, so here, one is the faith has taken root. One has believed and is following and seeking God, even with joy. But what happens? Some external source of problems, tribulations, persecution, comes and the person can't deal with it and falls away. Okay, so the difficulty is not surmounted. And then what happens too, the difficulty, notice, is more from the outside. Then let's go on the third seed. The seed sown among thorns is the one who hears the word, but then worldly anxiety and the lure of riches choke the word, and it bears no fruit. Right? Worldly anxiety and the lure of riches, worldly cares. Right? So here we're moving a little bit more towards things that are within us. Right? So worldly anxiety, there can be things going on around you that cause that anxiety, but it also, I think, can be understood here as you care too much about worldly things, and therefore you worry about them too much. And then the lure of riches, you care too much, you want too much to have riches, and that competes and chokes off the life, the theological life within you, the life of God within you, that's leading you to the attainment of God, right? So here, just an example of some of the challenges we face if we're going to be able to attain God. Okay, so we can think about other things as well. One thing that's interesting to think about is just the time, the wait, right? Think of Janice having to wait for the iPhone. To attain God, it takes time, right? Because the journey to God involves our conversion, and our conversion takes time, right? And we can get impatient, and we don't want to deal with it, and we find that we can't deal with it, okay? But we need to deal with it. We need to be patient, right? Is one of the translations from I think a passage from Luke, the Gospel of Luke, is through patience you will save your souls. Okay, so there's a bunch of obstacles. So the first condition for hope applies to the theological virtue of hope. That is, we want something, we don't yet have it, the full enjoyment of God, or salvation. Second condition is that there's an obstacle, or more than one, in between us and what we want, our goal. There are certainly that. We just went over some ways of thinking about that. Okay, so then the third condition is you think that the obstacles can be overcome. You think that the obstacles can be overcome. If you don't think the obstacles can be overcome, you despair, right? And sometimes there's a quiet form of despair. We don't explicitly acknowledge it, but you've given up, okay? So we can give up in our pursuit of God, and we can pretend we're still doing it, or we can pretend we're still Christians, but we don't have this lively hope within us. Our hope has died. We give it lip service. We think we have it. We kind of deceive ourselves about it. But there's a quiet despair instead. We don't have lively hope. Okay? Right? And here's, I want to add something that's not often brought up, but is a true teaching. To despair, in this sense, of attaining God, that's a sin, right? This is the traditional teaching. It's a sin to despair, right? Because, why? Because it's always possible. It's always possible because God will help us. If we despair, we're saying God can't help us, right? And that's not acceptable. All right, but this leads into something I want to say more about. This condition of the third condition, you think the obstacle can be overcome. So one way of thinking about this is the distinction that's been made between what you hope for and what you hope in. Okay, what you hope for is what you want to attain. So what we're hoping for here is God, the enjoyment of God. Okay, what we hope in is what we think will help us overcome the obstacles, right? So you might hope in yourself. You can say, I can do it myself. I can overcome all these obstacles. I have the ability to do it, right? Then you hope in yourself, your own abilities, or you hope in the help of another human being, right? Now, the virtue of hope is a theological virtue. So its object is God. So we hope for God. That's our object, right? But it's also the object of God in this sense. What we hope in is God, right? Scripture says, don't put your trust in human beings and flesh, right? Or in princes and leaders and people of power and influence, or in horses, it says, right? So like military power and having different means at your assistance, right? Put your hope in God. You need God's help. It's only by God's help that you can overcome the obstacles between you and the enjoyment of God. And again, it's a sin to say God can't do that, to despair. Because even though it's so hard, even though we sin, and sometimes when we sin, we're discouraged, and we want to give up and say, there's no point, I'm useless, I'm hopeless. No, God doesn't want you to give up. When you sin, you do something really bad, still, you say, God can forgive me. I put my hope in God. God is able to forgive my grievous sin. I won't give up, not because I trust in myself, not because I'm so great. No, I'm a sinner, but God is loving, and God can, who's all-powerful, God can overcome whatever obstacle it is, including my own guilt and faults and so forth. Okay? So it's a sin to despair. And that's because what we hope in is God. So we hope for God, but we also hope in God. That's the theological virtue and act of hoping. To do that. Okay, so it's very, very important. All right, so those are all the conditions. I'm not even talking about the act of hope yet in itself. I'm just talking about the conditions. So the conditions, again, just to summarize, are that you want something, you don't yet have it, so God, the enjoyment of God. There's obstacles or an obstacle in the way of you and what you want, right? So there's plenty of obstacles in the way between difficulties, challenges, right? Between me and the attainment of God, so as to enjoy God. Between me and the full enjoyment of God, my salvation. Okay, so there's plenty of obstacles there. And then you think that those obstacles can be overcome. As I just said, you do think that because God can do it. Not because I can, but God can. Right? I have to cooperate with God, right? But still, God can do it. So there's always hope. There's no reason for despair. Okay, so now we can talk about what the act of hope is in itself. Not just these conditions, but the very act, okay? It's a little hard to pinpoint, but doing all these conditions should help us. So the very act of hope is what results when all those conditions are in place. You want something, you don't have it, there's obstacles, but then you think the obstacles can be overcome. What is the result then when you think that? When you don't think it, you despair, and you have the sinking feeling, right? The sinking experience. Okay, but when you think the obstacle can indeed be overcome, what happens? You have, I'll call it this, you have an uplifting movement of your will towards the goal. Okay, so you're facing a difficulty, you want something, you face a difficulty, and you think it can be overcome. What happens? The soul, particularly the will in the soul, is uplifted towards the good. It's kind of renewed in this uplifting movement towards the goal, towards what you want, right? So this uplifting movement of the will towards what you want, towards the goal, that is hope. That in itself is hope. So you need to have the ability to do that, right? Because when you seek God and you're on this journey to God and we love God, we want to enjoy God, clinging to God, okay, and all that, we will face obstacles. And so you can either sink into despair, your will can sink down and just stop seeking the goal, God, the enjoyment of God. Or in the face of those difficulties, you need to have the ability to lift, the will needs to kind of have this ability to lift itself up and keep going, right? Don't give up. So this uplifting movement of the will, to do that, you need to be able to do that. Now, this act, though, doesn't exist in isolation. So again, it's based on thinking that the obstacles can be overcome. And why do we think that? It's an act of faith. Because God has said, nothing is impossible for me. And he says again and again, and he shows it again and again in salvation history, I can lift you up from the hardest troubles, including some of the most despairing things or discouraging things, which is our own sinfulness. Right? God is saying, no, I can uplift you from that. I can overcome all those obstacles. I'll wipe your sins away, and I will make a way for you to lead you to the kingdom of perfect peace and enjoyment of God forever. Right? So God has said this, right? God has revealed this. And so our hope is based on the act of faith, of accepting this promise to help us, and that he can do it. We accept that as true. That's an act of faith. So hope is built on the act of faith. It's a distinct act, this movement of the will towards the good in the face of difficulty, but it's towards the goal, right? In the face of difficulty, but it's based on the act of faith. And so as we read in the letter to the Hebrews, right? Faith is the assurance of things unseen. It is the substance of things hoped for, is an old translation. Some of the current translations I don't like, to be honest, right? But the Greek word is hard to translate, so it is difficult. But a traditional way of looking at this is, the word is this, it's what stands under things hoped for. Okay? So it's what kind of supports hope. So faith, that act of believing that God can help us, that God will help us, and that he has this plan for us, right? To accept those promises and that plan that he's revealed to us, that is the basis for having this uplifting movement towards God, right? In a way, renewing our journey towards God. Okay, so that's what hope is. And to have a theological virtue, hope, you have to have the ability to have that, right? And it's built again on the act of faith. So you can see here too how it relies also on charity, because the first condition is you want, right? You want God, right? That's the goal, right? So that's what charity is, right? So you have to have that also. But then when you have these difficulties, you have to then think that the obstacles can be overcome by the help of God, which has been revealed to us, that God can do that, right? So we have charity and we have faith, and hope relies on both of them. But it's so important because we're discouraged. We face difficulties, right? So it's great. This is what we need. Hope is so important in our journey to God. All right, one last thing to throw out here, and I don't know, I have to decide, but in the next class I might say some more things about hope. There's so much to be said, and it's very practical too. But it's this. One last thing is that this uplifting movement of the will, well, it feels good, right? It's enjoyable in itself, right? So you have that sinking experience of despair. It's not enjoyable. But if you have the uplifting movement of the will, renewing your pursuit of the good, of the goal, God, the enjoyment of God, that itself is enjoyable. Okay, so when we ultimately attain God, that will be the fullest joy. But when we have, even in the meantime, some ability to lift up the soul in this, then that too is enjoyable. So if you look at Romans 12, verse 1, it says that rejoice in hope. There's an important passage for St. Augustine. Rejoice in hope. So when you have hope, there's a joy in itself. So that sustains us on the journey as well. Rejoice in hope. You have joy. We're seeking the enjoyment of God, the full enjoyment of God. But even before we reach that reality, even now we have a certain joy in hope. Okay, so that's very important. So hope is very important for everything. This uplifting movement is very important to sustain us. And this is also why people seek false hopes. It's because hope is enjoyable. So they want something enjoyable. They want to be uplifted. And so people will have false hopes. They'll say, be overly optimistic, and they'll cling to things like, oh, everything's going to be fine. It's going to be great. And the reasons they give aren't very convincing if they stopped and thought about them. But that's not the point. The point is they want to feel good. They want to be encouraged, right? The problem with false hopes is that they'll eventually crash on you, and you end up in a bigger pit of despair than before. So God is our ultimate hope, right? The one we hope for, and also the one we hope in. So don't place your hope, don't place your trust in other things, right? They aren't guaranteed, but God is guaranteed. He will lead us to himself, to enjoy him, and he will do that by his own power and help. So we hope in him as well. So maybe some more on hope later, I'm not sure, but this is the basics of it. It's so important in our theological life, and our spiritual life, and in our journey to God. So may your hope be renewed, and I hope this video helps in some way towards that. God bless.